I've been sitting with this topic for months, opening documents, reading studies, looking at the latest data, and then closing everything because I wasn't sure I had the right words for what I was seeing. But I think the moment for careful framing has passed. I think you deserve a straight conversation about where we actually are, what the data actually shows, and what any of us can realistically do with that information. So this is that conversation. No softening, no false hope at the end to make you feel better about clicking away, but also, and I mean this, no surrender. Because those two things, honesty about how bad this is and refusal to give up on what can still be done, are not contradictory. They are the only combination that is worth anything at this point. Let's start with a question that a scientist I deeply respect asked publicly, and that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. Have we already lost? David Suzuki is one of the most respected environmental scientists and communicators of the past half-century. He has spent decades trying to translate climate science into terms that ordinary people could understand and act on. He has been patient, persistent, and relentlessly optimistic about humanity's capacity to change course when confronted with evidence. When David Suzuki says humanity has lost the fight against climate change, that is not a statement made lightly. That is not pessimism from someone who never believed. That is a conclusion reached by someone who spent 50 years believing and watching the evidence accumulate in one direction. Is he right? Let's look at what the data actually says, because that question deserves an honest answer rather than a reflexive reassurance. The scientific target that has defined international climate negotiations for over a decade is 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels. Let me define what that means precisely, because this number is used so frequently that it has lost its meaning for most people. The pre-industrial period refers to the baseline global average temperature before human industrial activity began significantly adding carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Roughly, this means the late 1700s through the mid-1800s, before coal-powered industrialization began reshaping the atmosphere at scale. 1.5 degrees Celsius above that baseline was established as the more ambitious target in the Paris Agreement, with 2 degrees as the outer limit beyond which scientists warned the consequences would become increasingly catastrophic and increasingly difficult to reverse. Those are not arbitrary numbers. They represent thresholds identified through thousands of studies examining how Earth's interconnected systems respond to temperature change. Coral reef die-off rates, ice sheet stability, sea level rise trajectories, extreme weather frequency, agricultural yield impacts. The difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is not just half a degree on a thermometer. It is the difference between hundreds of millions of people facing severe water stress and over 1 billion. It is the difference between certain coral reef systems surviving and essentially all of them collapsing. It is the difference between manageable disruption and systemic threat to food and water security for populations that had no meaningful role in causing the problem. Where are we now? The most recent data shows global average temperatures running at approximately 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Some years we breach it, some years we sit just below it. The trend line points clearly in one direction. The 1.5 degree target, the more ambitious Paris Agreement goal, is effectively gone. Not officially abandoned, not formally declared failed, but gone in the sense that the emissions trajectory required to keep warming below that threshold would have required action decades ago that did not happen. So yes, on that specific measure, Suzuki's assessment is accurate, but that is not the same as game over. And understanding why requires understanding how we got here, because without that history, the current situation looks like bad luck rather than what it actually is, a long sequence of choices. In 1992, the world came together at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro and produced the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The scientific understanding of the greenhouse effect was already clear. The mechanism by which fossil fuel emissions were warming the planet was not contested among scientists. The Rio framework was supposed to be the beginning of coordinated international action to address it. What followed was the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, binding emissions reduction targets for developed nations. A framework with legal teeth, or so it seemed. The United States signed it, and then the Senate refused to ratify it. The largest per capita emitter at the time walked away from the first binding international climate agreement. The next decade produced variations on the same pattern. Negotiations, commitments, targets, and then the erosion of those commitments when they came into contact with the political and economic power of industries with profound financial interests in the continuation of the status quo. The Cancun Agreement in 2010 produced pledges that independent analysis showed were insufficient to meet the stated goals, even if fully implemented, and full implementation was never achieved. The Paris Agreement in 2015 was described as a historic turning point, and in procedural terms, it was significant. Nearly every nation on Earth signed. The framework was universal, The language was clear about the 1.5 and 2 degree targets, but Paris had a structural weakness that undermined its historical significance. The emissions reduction commitments, called nationally determined contributions, were voluntary. Nations set their own targets. Nations monitored their own compliance. There was no enforcement mechanism. An agreement where every signatory sets their own goals and faces no consequence for missing them is not a binding agreement. It is a coordinated press release. In the decade since Paris, global emissions have continued to rise. Not at the same rate as the decade before, which represents genuine progress on the rate of increase, but rising. When emissions need to fall sharply and consistently to stabilize the climate, continuing to rise in the wrong direction is not partial success. It is continued failure at a slightly slower pace. This is the history. Every major opportunity, every significant international gathering, every framework that was supposed to finally translate scientific consensus into the action that consensus demanded, and every time, the gap between what was agreed and what was done. To understand why this keeps happening, you need to understand something that took me a long time to fully process. The narrative of individual responsibility for climate change is one of the most successful public relations campaigns in corporate history. The concept of the personal carbon footprint was popularized by a BP advertising campaign in the early 2000s. A fossil fuel company promoted the idea that climate change was a problem of individual consumer choices, that the solution lay in each person calculating and reducing their personal emissions through purchasing decisions and lifestyle changes. This framing is not entirely wrong. Individual choices do matter. Collective consumer behavior does influence markets. None of that is false. But it is catastrophically incomplete in a way that has served specific interests for decades. 20 companies, 20 state-owned and private fossil fuel corporations, are responsible for approximately 1/3 of all global carbon emissions since 1965. 1/3 from 20 entities. The math of individual action versus institutional action is not complicated. The aggregate lifestyle changes of billions of individuals competing in an economic system that has systematically subsidized fossil fuel production, while externalizing its costs, cannot match the impact of regulatory, legal, and economic pressure on the entities actually extracting and burning the fuel. This is not an argument against individual action. It is an argument against individual action as a substitute for systemic change. When you feel guilty about your flight, your diet, your car, while the regulatory frameworks governing the 20 companies, responsible for 1/3 of global emissions, remain structurally inadequate, the guilt has been successfully redirected from where it belongs. The anger you may feel reading this is appropriate. It is not irrational. It is a reasonable response to a factual situation. The question is what to do with it. Let me explain the framework that climate scientists use to assess our overall situation, because it provides more context than temperature alone. Scientists have identified 9 planetary boundaries, thresholds in Earth's natural systems that define the safe operating space for human civilization. These include climate change, but also biodiversity loss, freshwater use, land system change, ocean acidification, and others. These systems are interconnected. The climate boundary does not operate in isolation. A climate that is changing faster than ecosystems can adapt drives biodiversity loss. Biodiversity loss affects carbon storage in forests and soils. Deforestation for agriculture changes land systems and releases stored carbon. Each boundary transgression can trigger or accelerate others. Current assessments suggest that humanity has already transgressed several of these boundaries. Climate change is the most discussed, but biodiversity loss, measured in species extinction rates and land system change, measured in forest cover reduction, are also showing significant transgressions. This is why climate scientists increasingly talk not just about temperature targets, but about the broader integrity of Earth's life support systems. The 1.5 degree conversation is important, but it is one dimension of a multidimensional problem. The good news embedded in this framing, and there is genuine good news here, is that many of these boundaries are not binary. They are not a cliff edge where crossing them means instant collapse. They are gradients, and that means action taken now, even after breaching a threshold, still changes the outcome. Warming that reaches 1.6 degrees is worse than 1.5. Warming that reaches 1.7 is worse than 1.6. Every fraction of a degree avoided represents real people who face less severe consequences, real ecosystems that have more time to adapt, real options that remain available to future generations that would be foreclosed by additional warming. This is what makes the game overframing, while emotionally understandable, scientifically incomplete. The 1.5 degree target may be effectively lost. The fight for every fraction of a degree above that threshold has not been lost and cannot be abandoned. I want to tell you about something that exists right now that I think represents the kind of action that the current moment actually calls for. Planet Wild is a community of people collectively funding specific, documented nature restoration projects, not abstract carbon offsets, not promises about future reforestation, actual projects with before and after documentation, verified outcomes, and direct connection between funding and result. The reason I'm including this specifically is not because I think nature restoration solves climate change by itself. It does not. But I think there is something psychologically and practically important about connecting the recognition of how serious the situation is to direct participation in doing something tangible about it. The research on climate anxiety is clear that awareness without agency is psychologically corrosive. Knowing how bad things are without any sense of connection to action that matters produces despair rather than motivation. Planet Wild provides a direct, verifiable connection between individual participation and measurable restoration outcomes. The link is in the description. I would encourage you to look at what they are actually doing and judge it on those terms. Here is where I want to leave this conversation. The fight to stay below 1.5 degrees is effectively over. That is honest. That is what the data says. Telling you otherwise would be doing you a disservice. The fight to stay well below 2 degrees, to prevent 2 from becoming 2.5, to prevent 2.5 from becoming 3, that fight is ongoing and the outcome is not determined. The narrative that individual consumer choices are the primary lever of change is a fiction that has served the interests of the institutions most responsible for the problem. Systemic change, regulatory, legal, economic, political pressure on the entities and the systems that produce the majority of emissions is where the leverage actually sits. The outrage is justified. The despair is understandable. Neither of them is useful unless they convert into the kind of persistent collective pressure that has actually changed systemic problems throughout history. Climate change is not a technical problem awaiting a technical solution. The science has been clear for 40 years. It is a political and economic problem. And political and economic problems respond to organized, sustained collective pressure from people who refuse to accept that the situation is fixed. I did not want to make this video because there is no comfortable version of it. But the uncomfortable version, the honest one, is the only one that is worth your time. And you deserve honest,